Hey, Mike.
Hi, Caleb. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. What are you drinking tonight?
I have actually made up a cocktail.
Oh.
Since this is the return of the Alien Dreadnought, I have actually made up a cocktail called the Alien Dreadnought. And it is actually surprisingly delightful. It came out better than I was expecting. So I'll post the recipe with the show notes on Reddit.
Can I take a guess of one of the components?
Oh, yeah, sure.
Chartreuse.
No, I actually did not.
Oh.
I almost put some yellow chartreuse in, but I withheld it. So I'll have to try a variation and see if that makes it any better. But it's Laird's apple brandy, some sweet vermouth, and some Benedictine, and I have these Fees Brothers cocktail bitters, which are quite nice. So yeah. Anyways, I guess I just spoiled the recipe, but I'll put the exact ratios in there. How about you? What are you drinking tonight?
Well, I'm feeling a little under the weather tonight, so I'm having a classic fizzy water.
Okay, so a gin and tonic minus the gin
and the sugar. It's just a Pellegrino.
Oh, okay. All right, mineral water then.
Mineral water, yeah.
Okay. Well, I'm sorry to hear that.
It's all right. The show must go on, as P.T. Barnum would say.
I would say the show can't go on. You don't have a cocktail. All right, so let's wrap it up. Where can people reach us if they want to complain about your drink selection?
Apparently, people skip this part of the show, so most people won't even hear this.
All right, so I shouldn't be dragging it on even further then. So let's dive into some numbers.
Yeah, so today I thought we could talk mostly about the Q3 earnings call and results that came out. Last week was a very busy week for Tesla. They had the earnings call, and then on Friday they also had the Solar City Tesla announcement of the solar roofs and the new power pack and power wall.
So they're operating under the assumption that the acquisition is going to go, the merger is going to go through.
Yeah, they had no Solar City branding on anything. So
I'm sorry, I'm jumping ahead. We'll address that next week.
Yeah, so I thought we could talk about it next week. There'll be some more research we want to do on roofing and roofs in all around the world and try and get more detail as it comes out over the coming days about the roofing product. So I thought we could cover the Q3 earnings call since that's more pressing and it happened first, and we'll do roofing on the next episode.
Wow, that's quite a tease. Next episode, tune in for details on roofing.
Yeah, we have a very enthralled audience, I'm sure. So some of the highlights. It was a profitable quarter for Tesla, the first in 3 years. So they pulled off what they had stated they were attempting to do for this quarter, be profitable on both a GAAP and non-GAAP basis.
Can you explain what that means?
Yeah, so companies can report earnings excluding certain items to better communicate to the investing community how they feel and manage the business. And then there are generally accepted accounting principles, which is the long version of GAAP. And that is what all companies need to adhere to when they report earnings so that they're comparable against other companies. And so many technology companies, for instance, like to tout their non-GAAP earnings because they exclude certain non-cash items like stock-based compensation expense. So instead of paying people all with cash, like most companies, many tech companies give people stock options. And Tesla does this as well. And then there are also some other items where there's certain accounting rules around how you deal with leases and certain items where maybe you sold the item and you expect to receive the revenue, but you have to account for it in parts as you actually receive the cash.
Oh, sorry, I dozed off right there.
You asked for an explanation.
I regretted it immediately.
I'm sorry. So
no, that's okay. All right. So generally accepted accounting practices. So it's kind of a level playing field for comparing stock of company A to company B.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So they were profitable. So they the top line was $2.3 billion in revenue with a net income, so profit of $22 million. And Wall Street was expecting a loss. So they beat expectations, and they also generated $176 million in free cash flow. So basically cash generated through the operations during that period.
Wait, so can you explain that? What is free cash flow and how does that relate to profit?
Yeah, so if you think about it in terms of like a normal household budget or spending, if you bring in $1,000 in cash and you ended up spending $500 in cash, you would have $500 in free cash flow, essentially. But you could owe someone money and commit to them, but it's not due for the next month or next week. So you actually now have a new liability, which you're committed to, which would decrease your profits, but your cash flow is actually high. So it basically just helps to make sure you understand what your cash basis is, because you could also have the opposite, where you have commitments for revenue that you're going to start sort of putting on your books, but you actually don't have any cash to support it because you didn't get paid yet. And so your business you could go out of business because you don't have any cash coming in and you can't make your payroll, even though you've just made a lot of big deals, for instance.
Okay, so now if we're talking about, what did you say, 3.2 or was it 2.3 billion?
2.3 billion in revenue.
Okay, so 2.3 billion in revenue and then $22 million of profit on that. That's like, what, 1% maybe? So that seems like we're getting into such a huge amount of revenue, such a small amount of profit. It feels like they could have had either some profit or no profit, depending on how they decided to move their money around. It feels like it's not a significant amount.
Yes, so that's true. They did a few things in the quarter to help, and also some things that would have hurt that number. So they invested $250 million towards increasing production capacity. So that would have been under what's called capital expenditure, CapEx. So they spent $250 million on the Gigafactory, on some of the production for Model 3, and also for more stores and superchargers. So they could have spent less there, and they would have had more net income. They also paid off $600 million in debt, which would have helped their balance sheet, or would have sort of shown up as more free cash. And then the sort of important thing is, like, they started the quarter with $3.2 billion in cash, and they ended with 3.1. So they basically had no impact on their cash. And that's a really important thing for Tesla in particular, is that the challenge with anything, and we've talked about this in the past, producing cars is a very capital intensive process. It takes a lot of money to build the facilities to make cars. And so there's always been a concern that Tesla's just burning cash, like all these headlines of burning cash and just destroying cash and needing more and more money, that this is really one of the first times they've been able to show that their operations actually are sort of funding them. So it's basically running at break even, as you pointed out.
Do you think it's more of a public relations decision to do that? Or I feel like it could have probably massaged the numbers to have profit or not have profit at that level?
Yeah, I think they certainly were very sensitive to all of the components that went into it. And I think that they wanted to make sure they had a profit this quarter. But I think many quarters they've wanted to have a profit, but they were so far off, hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars, that there's no way they could have massaged it and not impacted their actual practices and like going concern things. So they've generally said we're investing for growth, and they feel, and on the call they talked about it a lot, and we'll get into it, but they feel like they're continuing to invest for growth, and they still had these results. And that they expect next quarter will also be profitable. So Elon on the call sort of talked about how he heard a lot of people saying, well, they're just, to your point, manipulating this quarter to sort of steal from the next quarter or put off expenses for the next quarter. And they did a pretty good job of dissuading people that there was any big sort of push-offs where they're trying to hide stuff under the rug, as it were.
It's on it's all on the up and up.
Yeah, so it seems pretty good. So they did 24,821 deliveries. So a few episodes ago, we talked about that first number that came out a few weeks ago for how many they had delivered. And this actually was 300 more than from that initial count. Remember, we said it could be a couple percentage points plus or minus. So it was actually 300 more than they originally reported. And one of the other really cool things was that one of the challenges would be with Model S, for instance. It's been around since 2012. Is demand still strong? There was also concerns that people were saying, well, they're just selling a lot of inventory cars. They're slashing prices and discounting to sell all these. Do people actually want the Model S still? And deliveries grew 60% year over year in the US market. So from Tesla's point of view, and they wanted to make it clear that deliveries are still strong, and demand is still strong for the Model S and still growing, actually.
So as I'm hearing that, I'm wondering, does that mean that more people can afford a Model S that couldn't previously afford one? Or is it that people who are already in that segment of the market have come up to like, their lease or their whatever is up, and they decided to go with the Model S this time. Do you know if the segment that they're in has grown and they're growing with it, or is it that they're converting people who would otherwise be BMW or Mercedes owners?
Yeah, it's a bit of both. So on the cost side, they called out specifically that the 60 kilowatt hour pack Model S, which was introduced in the very beginning of the quarter, very end of last quarter, has been very strong. There's been a lot of demand for that lower priced entry-level Model S. And also the numbers came out for the comparisons for the Model S versus the 7 Series BMW and the Audi A8, and they continue to take share from them, even though the total market for that for the segment isn't growing proportionally. So they're on a relative basis increasing their share and stealing it from those people, from those other manufacturers. So yeah, there are more people choosing Model S who potentially would have been choosing one of the other car makers' large $50,000, $60,000, $70,000 sedans. And so that also is good news that there currently is not another vehicle that is stealing share from Tesla. They just continue to be taking small bits from all the other major luxury brands in the segment. And one of the other things about the profit was to the discounting, right? Remember, there were all those people saying that Tesla was doing this massive discounting, and Elon even came out and said there were a few cases of it on Twitter and that he was going to put an end to it. And some people were saying that was quite convenient to say that at the end of the quarter after all those discounts had been given. And so many analysts were concerned that they had put a fire sale on, essentially, and that sure, you sold a lot of cars, but at very poor margin would not be good. And so they had very clear answers for this to try and rebut this. So gross profits for the automotive sector, so the car sales, were actually up quarter over quarter, up to 25%. So 25% gross margins on the cars. And so that was up 1.4 percentage points from the previous period, which is a pretty good increase. And so that came from increased efficiency, so spending less time actually manufacturing the vehicles. The actual cost of the parts that went into them was down a little bit. The amount of extra shipping they paid to expedite parts to make sure the deliveries kept up went down because their supply chain is getting more consistent and robust. And then also they got more leverage on the factory and the labor costs. So if you can produce more cars per hour in the factory, you're still paying the people the same amount, but they can make more cars. And so the cost per car for labor and sort of the factory costs go down. And so that also contributed to it.
So do they specify any way to tell if that is a reduction in the cost of the raw materials, where the price of the car stays the same, but the price of, say, raw aluminum goes down? Or is it, can we tell that it is actually them getting more efficient at actually producing them?
Yeah, so there were two components. So the big piece was Model X pricing was one of the biggest components that made the margin go up. And so when Model X was first started, they were using what they called a lot of prototype parts. And so they had contracts for smaller batches of them, and they had to run through all of those. And so the CFO called out that they've been using fewer of the prototype parts, and they almost all the way through all their prototype contracts.
I like to imagine there's an army of 3D printers just like creating one-off components in the factory.
Yeah, so they basically are starting to get to better volume pricing for many of the Model X components. Mm-hmm. They also have been switching out parts and switching out suppliers that they said had a neutral effect on the performance for the customer, but had a pretty big cost decrease. So lower cost parts that in their view don't change the actual performance of the said part. So it's not clear if that's actually, a material cost difference, but it is something they called out, that perhaps a seal or a piece of glass or a set of bolts, they're now getting cheaper, or they've engineered a thinner bolt or a smaller bolt or something that now reduces the cost. And then, as I was just mentioning also, that because there are 4,000 to 5,000 parts in one of these cars and SUVs, if one of them is late, it stops the line. And so they previously, because they were still sorting out their production facilities, were expediting a lot of these parts and paying a lot for extra shipping. And as we all know as consumers, overnight shipping is pretty expensive. It's really expensive when the parts are made of metal and really heavy and large.
Have they considered signing up for Amazon Prime?
They did not call out Amazon Prime, but they should talk to Jeff Bezos about that. But we actually do have some new info on shipping, which is kind of cool.
Okay. They're not using OnTrack, are they? Because that's a terrible idea.
No, even though they're in Nevada. It's a tease, but they're going to start renting out entire boats. So that had a pretty good element. And they said of the price decreases of Model S, so the average selling price of Model S went down quarter over quarter, primarily because of the 60 kilowatt hour pack. About a third of the decrease was because of discounting. So the average selling price went down 6%, and 2 percentage points of that 6% were discount. So a very small percentage of cars were discounted. And you can see that because the selling price didn't go down drastically. So that's good to know. And I don't expect to see too much about that in the future, since it seems to be a non-issue.
Cool. So what else do we have? We have like stores and superchargers in here as well?
Yeah, they gave us some more numbers there. So remember last time we were talking, they said they were going to try and open one new store every 4 days. And that was kind of surprising to us.
It's a bit optimistic, yeah.
So they opened 17 new stores this quarter. So they fell a little short. You would have expected 23 new store openings, so 6 more than they did.
Yeah, that's still more than one a week, right? Well, we have like 13 weeks in a quarter, so they're
yep.
1 point something per week.
And so now they're up to a nice even 250 stores worldwide. And then superchargers, they ended with 715 locations with 4,461 actual plugs.
Is that US or globally?
That's global.
Okay.
And so 6 months previously, Q1, they ended with 615 and 3,600. So I computed it. And so in 6 months, they've grown superchargers 16%, and the actual points, the actual chargers themselves, 24%.
Do you suspect that they're going to accelerate that as the Model 3 rollout nears? Like, do you think 2017 will see as much supercharger expansion as it does like Model 3 ramp up?
I think it has to, I think it needs to, because 24% increase in the number of actual charging plugs is not keeping pace with the ratio of cars sold. I mean, they've sold more than 24% more cars in that 6-month period. And so what that means then is they either believe that the efficiency and the ratio of cars to supercharger locations has more room to fall out of line, where they believe there could be more cars per supercharger location still. And so they can let those diverge, or they're having trouble actually getting the permits and getting them installed. It doesn't seem to be a cost problem. They have never called out that it's too expensive for them or that they're having any material challenges with superchargers. So it seems as if they're going to plan. It's not something they're calling out. And we also know that the Model 3 will not have the supercharging included for free, or the usage for free, as it is with the Model S and X. And so perhaps they still believe a much smaller percentage of Model 3 owners will opt for that. But it is a concern, and one of the challenges obviously is that peak demand around the holidays in certain corridors is more challenging than others. But they called out that now 97% of the population in the US and 86% in Western Europe are now within 150 miles of superchargers. So 150 miles would indicate that,
That's pretty far.
Well, on all their cars, you could get to a supercharger to continue your distance.
Yeah, that's a road trip analysis, not a daily life analysis.
And I think that's the point, is that they still see superchargers as a road tripping device, and many users are using them as a daily charging device. And I think that's the disconnect between the owners and Tesla that is one of the sources of frustration. Clearly, many of the people who are using California superchargers in Mountain View are not road tripping. They live around Mountain View or Palo Alto or San Jose or in LA, the folks in LA using LA superchargers. So that's going to be something that I think will need to be addressed. And, they have things they could do there, but I do agree they need more.
Yeah, especially as you get into the Model 3 and the lower cost model, being that people who purchase that might not necessarily have, they might not own their residence that they live in, right? So they're renters or they have street parking, and charging at your place of work or at some other point along the course of your weekly life, that becomes a bigger concern.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, it's something that's a concern for me. My building isn't going to let me put in a charger in my carport, even though California says they need to. So we'll see if I want to push on that or try and get it installed at where I work. It's definitely something it's going to continue to come up, and I think could be one of the primary challenges for Model 3 owners. And I have to believe Tesla has thought about this. And the question is, do they take the approach of, well, that's not a good product for you, or this is a problem we need to solve and we just haven't told people what the solution is yet?
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how much they've sort of gotten out of the building, as it were, because I was actually back home in New Hampshire this past week, and I was talking to my parents about electric cars because they're in the market for a new vehicle, and we were talking about hybrids and electric vehicles. And it was really interesting to get a baby boomer perspective, and they're not car people at all. So it was very interesting to hear, like, there was a lot of confusion around hybrids and are hybrids plugged in, and now there's like a plug-in hybrid, and there's this like concept of plug-in hybrids, which is further confusing in the sort of layperson's mind, this idea of plugins and hybrids and when you can charge, and I guess abstract range anxiety that was coming out ahead of time. It was just really interesting to talk about that and explain how range and charging and how that works. Yeah, it was pretty interesting to kind of step outside the Silicon Valley bubble and hear about what the average American thinks about. I don't know if they're average. That might have been a bit presumptuous.
Did they have any thoughts or opinions on Tesla in particular?
Well, they're not in the market for Tesla. I mean, they're might be closer to being in the market for like a Model 3, I guess, in that range. They're not going to be spending $100,000 on a car. Plus, they're snowbirds from New Hampshire as well, so they have the road trip down to Florida once a year to migrate south for the winter. So, you know, that's also a bit of a concern. Although they do have two vehicles, so, you know, they could have one that is for road trips and one that's for city, but it's very much not in their mindset. Either vehicle should be able to do either in their the way they think of vehicles.
Got it.
So it's more of a bug than a feature.
Speaking of snowbirds in Florida and sunshine, Solar City was also mentioned on the call. And
nice segue.
Thank you. Tesla is still in the process to acquire them. There's financials coming out November 1st, and then November 7th, I believe, is the vote. And so analysts were asking, what does Tesla expect this will do to Tesla's balance sheet and needs for cash? Because currently Solar City requires a lot of cash as well. And so Elon was saying on the call that he expects that it will be cash neutral to slightly positive in Q4 if the transaction goes through, and that he says he thinks things are looking good. And he said, I quote, "It's not to say that there's some darkness ahead. They look really quite good right now." So they currently believe Solar City will benefit from being inside of Tesla, and some of their own costs will be shared. Accounting people may be laid off and things like that. But the core business, they believe, will benefit from the Tesla stores and the Tesla customer base and marketing to the Tesla customer base that will reduce the customer acquisition costs, which is one of the primary reasons the Solar City uses so much cash. Is it currently costs them a lot to get a customer.
Hashtag synergy.
Hashtag synergy for sure.
But isn't debt really, really cheap right now?
Yeah, they said they've gotten some new debt around 2%. So debt is definitely quite cheap. Solar City's ratings are not that good. So Tesla's ratings are a bit better.
Credit ratings,
yeah. And also getting debt financing on solar panels is a little better since they are assets and they do generate revenue through electricity. So it's generally not been a problem for Solar City to get loans to pay for the solar panels, which they lease to customers. And so I expect Tesla will have a similar strength there, and will be able to benefit from that leasing for some other products they want to talk about in next episode.
All right. Yeah. Let's put a pin in that until next episode and maybe move on to autopilot and the transition away from Mobileye into the Tesla. Are they calling it the Octocam? Because I feel like if it's an 8-camera solution and they're not calling it the Octocam, they might be leaving money on the table there. So let's call it the Octocam and moving from Mobileye to Octocam.
So one of the analysts asked, is this full self-driving suite you put on the cars actually going to work?
Was he expecting a node that?
So that's one question about the guy's thoughtfulness on asking his question. But apparently in the past week or so since the announcement, Mobileye in particular and other analysts have come out and said they don't believe it's possible. And so Elon said, first of all, I'd like to separate what Tesla says from, say, some suppliers of ours is issuing bullshit. So I hadn't heard.
I'm sorry, is that an accounting term?
No, I don't think it's an accounting term. I think it's a calling out term. I hadn't heard him. I don't know if it's a swear word, I guess, but use that sort of language on an earnings call before, and he was definitely quite frustrated. And so he said, yeah, we feel highly confident that there's the 8-camera solution with 12 ultrasonics and the forward radar, and the computing power we have on board is capable of full autonomy at a level that's greater than a human. And he said, there are obviously skeptics out there. Well, I suggest they do not bet against us. And he was quite emphatic about that. So
did he slam his shoe on the table?
He didn't slam his shoe. He just sort of left it there. He was not equivocating on it. So I do believe there is a way it could have gone where they said, look, this is our expectation. We really believe it's possible, but we're still a few years away. But we've done everything we can with the hardware available, and we have high confidence. So he could have hedged, but that answer is not a hedging answer. So I guess there's some information in there.
He's more of a full steam ahead kind of guy.
He is more of a full steam ahead, but he does seem to talk about things in his best estimation. And so he'll say things like, this isn't a promise, but this is my best thinking, and that gets him into trouble sometimes, certainly on my best estimation of when this event will start.
Yeah. A little bit of a wink, wink, nudge, nudge.
Sure. Yeah. So he didn't, they currently believe that setup will work. And yet many of the folks in the self-driving community and world do not believe it will. So that will be exciting to watch over the next 6 months to a year to see the progressive rollouts of enhanced autopilot and then eventually the full self-driving and where that lands.
Yeah, it's not like there's a strong suite of evidence to buttress the negative claim either, right? Like exactly. No one really knows.
Yeah, the negative case is just that there are people who have put many more sensors on cars to make them self-driving, but they were not necessarily trying to create the minimum set of sensors. They were trying to create the maximal set to accelerate their ability to create self-driving. And I think even Elon Musk would agree that more sensors and different types of sensors would lead to more data, which would be helpful. The problem is those sensor suites are not cost acceptable for a shipping vehicle that is not going to cost many hundreds of thousands of dollars and certainly would not work on a $30,000 car. So no one to date who has self-driving vehicles out on the road been trying to figure out what that minimal set of acceptable sensors are. And Elon even said when the autopilot new hardware was released, hardware 2, that of course there would be updates over time and that the hardware would improve. But this is the baseline you need. So I think that it all jives with what they've said. And the financial community just obviously is not technically backed to understand self-driving vehicles. That's not their job. And so when they have folks they call for sources and they say there's no way that Tesla can do it, those are not Tesla employees saying it. They're non-Tesla employees.
They probably just see an enormous amount of risk that otherwise doesn't exist. No matter how dangerous the current situation is, at least it's not taking the risk on for the company.
Yep, for sure. I think they certainly see that there are many other automakers who are making cars and people are buying them in far greater quantities than Teslas. So why are you adding this extra risk? They didn't seem to ask many questions about what they thought it would do to the demand curve, which I think they should have been asking. But I would have wanted to ask, since the Autopilot 2, how many new orders have been coming in with people choosing the full self-driving option that you believe would not have come in otherwise? Something like that, to try and gauge what Tesla's belief is for the change the demand curve. Because if it doesn't change the demand curve, that, it is not as big a deal in the short term.
That's why they should be letting us on the calls, man.
They should.
They're missing out by not letting us on there. I think it's a weird argument to argue for more sensors as a irrefutable fact that like more is better, because you could argue that having a full F-15 heads up cockpit display in every vehicle would be safer than the current system of a dashboard and a loud radio and cell phones and a seat that can be reclined to people where they can't even see while they're driving. Like there's an awful lot of stuff that could be required and extra equipment that could be added to enhance the current manual driving experience that no one is arguing for.
Yeah, exactly.
So it seems a little bit weird to say that if you don't have LiDAR, that's a non-starter.
Yeah, I mean, two very simple options. You could enforce that the car can't move if the driver isn't wearing a seatbelt. And you could also put in breathalyzers into cars that they don't start. I
should point out that in New Hampshire, that would not work, because every time I go back to New Hampshire, as I mentioned I was this week, I am shocked by the fact that A, seatbelts are not mandatory, and B, motorcycle helmets are not mandatory. And I always do a double take when we go by someone on the highway going at 70 miles an hour on a motorcycle with no helmet on. It blows my mind. Anyways, sorry for the diversion.
Yeah, so certainly there are many other things we could do to push for more safety, and Elon Musk and Tesla are pushing the autonomy path, which they believe was more desirable than sort of the eat your vegetables approach of put your seatbelt on and enforcing that. But yeah, of course, there are many other things that you could ask every automaker to do to make cars more safe, and we are not currently pushing for those. So the fact you're going to chastise a company for not doing the most they possibly could do in a theoretical technical challenge seems a bit kettle black situation.
Yeah.
One of the other things on the safety side is they mentioned they talked to NHTSA, the National Highway Transportation Safety Administration. Nailed it a lot. And so they said we talked to them around a very detailed level on a daily basis, and they're certainly aware of the nitty gritty. And as I've said before, quoting Elon Musk, we've already seen a significant improvement in safety with the semi-autonomous features. And then he also said what's sort of less visible to the outside are all the cases where the version 1 of Autopilot actually did a lot to mitigate the accident. So the impact velocity went from being potentially fatal or severe to where the customer actually stepped away and walked away from the car. And there's very many of those, and those provide a statistically significant sample set far faster than fatalities because fatalities are extremely rare. And so that he thinks they need actually 6 billion miles with Autopilot so that you've got about 100 times the fatalities per mile ratio, where you'd really be able to say that it's statistically safer for fatalities, and that's where they need to get to. So, the new Autopilot hardware is just now being delivered. They've gotten hundreds of millions of miles on the first version, but they're going to need to get to billions of miles before they could prove the statistical safety on fatalities. But they will be able to prove statistical significance on reduced accidents a lot sooner. So that was some good new information from Tesla on the nuance of those two different categories of how they think about safety.
So you mentioned the number of Autopilot miles that they've logged, but you've also mentioned the changeover in Autopilot hardware. And did they give you any sort of indication as to how much of the learnings on the old equipment is generalizable to the new equipment? Or is it that you can imagine that, if you have one camera like Cyclops looking forward, that what you learn there isn't necessarily applicable to your 3 forward camera situation that they're going to have that they currently have with the new Autopilot hardware, and how much of that is all that old stuff tossed away, or is it just useful for mapping knowledge, or what's the breakdown there?
So we didn't get too much we didn't get anything on the call actually about that, except for that Tesla has said, and their head of Autopilot has said, that the Autopilot 1 does help with the fleet learning. And they haven't gone in much detail about the subsystems for Autopilot, but so now I'm going to move into speculation mode.
Can we get some background music for that?
So we know from the Comma AI guy, Holtz, that Mobileye was not providing Tesla the raw data feed of the video. They actually provide them sort of what he called the vision vectors, which was data input around what the camera was seeing to inform the decisions. So Tesla may not be able to train the vision side.
Does that mean they were seeing a car at like 30 degrees?
Yeah, it may have been something like that, where they were getting the actual output of computer readable information versus the actual, frames for their own neural network to assess.
Okay, so it was more abstract.
Black box sort of thing, yeah.
It was a level up in the layers of abstraction.
Right, but we know they already were fusing from radar and ultrasonics. So Tesla, if you zoom out, Tesla must have had a way to take the vision side from Mobileye, the ultrasonics, and the radar, fuse that together, and also combine that with the GPS and their high resolution maps. So you might be up to like 7 subsystems for what actually makes up the autopilot software. So if you take that to be true, which is an assumption about how those components would work software-wise, then it may be true that the radar, which they've been improving quite a lot in the version 8 change, would carry forward because the radar signals would be very similar since they've kept the same one radar. Now, the radar itself, the actual model has improved, but the learnings about how the radar sees the world and what they want to extract from that could be shared. What the ultrasonics see and how ultrasonics present their information to the software and the level to which they influence the decision making of the car could be potentially shared still. And then the high resolution mapping of locating where the car is in its lane and in the world potentially could also be shared because that's relying a lot on the GPS, and they create signatures of uniqueness along the roadway to localize where the car is. And so I think what actually happened, my best bet is that the reason the autopilot features have not been enabled is because that vision component was such a primary component of how autopilot worked. And so they actually need a lot more real world miles using that. But many of the other sensors, because if they think they're going to get there in 3 months from where we ship to saying December that the autopilot 1 level functionality would be available, then that would sort of indicate that the amount of miles they need is not so great, and that perhaps it really is just getting that vision data to supplement what they lost with Mobileye being pulled out of the system. And then from there, they're going to continue to ramp up to the new enhanced autopilot features. So TLDR, I think that there are many components that would be shared that are locked away in these subsystems, and the vision piece is what they really they can't get without the hardware actually being on the road.
Okay, so you think that there is a lot that's generalizable, but you're not entirely sure.
Yes.
All right. All right, so
another reason we need to get access to ask them some of these tough technical questions, which I hope they would ask or they would answer, but perhaps they wouldn't.
Can we send them an invite to our Slack channel or something here and get some direct info? All right, so we've got Gigafactory and Model 3, I think, are the last couple of items here.
Last 2 big items. So Gigafactory, highlight item, JB Straubel, their CTO, is point man on this project still. On track to begin cell production later this year, which was their stated goal for the past few years. Tesla's very confident it will have the best cell costs in the world once Gigafactory is up. And they're continuing to ramp up that 100 kilowatt hour battery pack, which was part of the P100D. That's not using Gigafactory yet, but I'm going to mention it in the same breath since it's battery related.
All right, so this should be affecting their margins then?
This helps pull up the margin. And the 100 kilowatt packs in particular are go into their highest priced vehicles. And so the more they can produce, the more high end vehicles they can sell. And apparently the 100 kilowatt packs are in very high demand. And this is one of Elon's top 3 priorities. He said priority 1 is Model 3, priority 2 is autopilot, and priority 3 is ramping up the 100 kilowatt hour packs, which was surprising to me. I wouldn't have pegged it that high on the priority list.
Yeah, well, it's a status symbol, I guess, if it's the most expensive Tesla.
And I think the other component there is remember, this is the first time they're using their new cell pack design. And this second generation seems like this might actually be part of the Model 3 pack structure. So they may be ironing out technical challenges that will then be applicable to the Model 3 packs. And so why it's such a big priority for Elon is not just the low volume of it, but it's refining a technology that's going to be part of Model 3. So then they put in those new cells from the Gigafactory, and while it's not going to be a 100 kilowatt hour pack, it will actually have the same sort of cooling structure potentially. So that's the only real reason I can imagine it's such a huge priority, is that there's new Model 3 technology, a part of it that they pulled forward, and sorting that out now with actual production cars is really a good way to reduce the risk for the Model 3 battery pack.
Right. Iron out the kinks at a lower volume. Because did they mention anything about the Consumer Reports downgrade of Tesla, particularly in related to the quality control issues on the Model X?
Tesla did not call out Consumer Reports by name on the call, but they made quite a large call out on the letter to shareholders about a 92% reduction in service requests for Model X over the past year, to try and allay fears that the Model X is a lemon of some sort, because Consumer Reports ranked it quite low.
I will say that during my test drive, the Model X that I test drove did have a malfunctioning center console door.
Yeah, and that's not going to be upgradable by software, so that's tough. That would require a human to fix that. Many of the things that Consumer Reports did call out as areas of concern were Falcon Wing doors, the locks and latches, power equipment, in-car infotainment, and I think, climate system. So
other than that, though,
it's great. It's great. So
the frunk is perfect.
But just to be so Consumer Reports is self-reported info from Consumer Reports users who own the car, and it's gathered over an entire year. And so the beginning of this year was really when the first Model X's really started making it to customers. And we know there were lots of issues, but the software has improved and the actual cars have improved. And Elon, over the previous earnings calls, was even camping out at the end of the Model X factory line. And he talked about that again this time, saying that there was just a lot of things broken in our production system. And then he said, I personally probably took a year off of my life or more camping out at Fremont, solving those number of issues with some of the other members of the Tesla team. And that he also went on to say, we went through bloody hell in the first half of this year. We got out of that basically around mid-June, and the results in achieving a weekly production target of roughly 2,000 cars a week show the results. So his point, and I think Tesla's point, is yes, the majority of our early Model X's did have problems. Customers had to come into the service area. We recognize that, we fixed those issues, and that now they believe Model X is on much stronger footing. And so similar to what happened with Model S, where last year it was below average rating and now it's average for service from Consumer Reports, I would expect that next year Model X, if it continues on this trajectory, would be upgraded next year.
Upgraded to average?
Upgrade to average.
All right.
But then Model S might be above average.
That's true. It's all about the trend line.
Yes. And so then lastly, the Model 3, the big part of everything that all this is going towards.
The coming storm.
Model 3 is on plan for volume deliveries in the second half of 2017, reiterated. So no change there. This would be the time to start letting that slip, because we're now 9 months from that happening.
I mean, they can't let that slip at this point. I mean, that has to happen.
Well, there are many people who believe it is inevitable as a result of the Tesla Roadster being late, the Model S being late, and the Model X being late. Speaking of trend lines, many people believe that trend line is unavoidable in the case of Tesla. And so if Tesla believed that they were going to slip, now would be the time to start softening the ground from a PR point of view, to reset expectations that, no, it's going to be the very end of 2017 instead of second half, or early 2018 volume deliveries. But they're still holding to second half volume deliveries of 2017.
Oh, really? I thought it was end of 2017.
No, second half.
Oh, that's even more optimistic than I was expecting.
Yes, that could be as soon as 9 months from now.
Okay, that just sounds ridiculous.
So update on what they've done on Model 3 in the past 3 months. So they said, we've completed the production line layouts and will soon begin installation of the new body welding and the final assembly lines. And they said, we've got all of our suppliers lined up and the production equipment and components have been sourced. And they now are testing vehicle subsystems such as the chassis, the high voltage drive system, low voltage systems such as vehicle controllers, HVAC, infotainment, and lighting. And as the refinement of Model 3 continues, we remain on plan for our timing, volume, vehicle capability, pricing, and margin targets. So they called out all of those components in the earnings letter, saying they're all on track.
What's the next milestone we should be looking for?
We should be looking for next quarter that they've got the body line set up and they're doing pre-production runs, either next quarter or the quarter after, and saying they've got their prototype vehicles coming off the line that they're now refining. That would sort of be the next major thing we'll hear about, because they said they've got their suppliers lined up, and the other thing that's going to be important is they said they're going to spend $1.8 billion on capital expenditures this year. They've only spent just around $800 million of that so far. So they have 3 months to spend $1 billion, and they expect they will on capital expenditure.
Like setting up the factory line? Is that?
Yeah. So this quarter, they're going to do 4 times more spending than they did last quarter on the factory, essentially. So this quarter, they're going to be installing a lot of robots.
And so when they install these, is there any sort of lead time? And I guess they must be incorporating this, but is there a lead time for, I give the company this much money to pay for these assembly line robots that I need, but when do they get delivered? They
called that out too. They said critical long lead time equipment and components have been sourced. So they've called out that the things that take the longest amount of time have already been sourced, and they will be available when they need them.
Okay, so the robot manufacturers are actually already getting ready for the... Okay.
Yeah. And they also said we don't need any more cash for the Model 3 program, that they believe with their current cash balance and projections of how the business will do, Model 3 does not need a cash infusion, either by selling more stock or issuing bonds. So they believe they have what they need to do that, and that they said that their projections just turned out a lot better than they expected, because when they modeled from X and S ramp and costs, they sort of did the multiplication and got to a bigger number than 1.8 billion in capex, but they've now pulled that back to just 1.8 because they have found ways to do it more efficiently. And one thing they said also was that they expect many of the payments will actually come in Q3 and Q4 of next year when they actually start production. And so they actually have deferred some of those payments with suppliers to later, which they couldn't get done with S and X because those companies wanted their cash and wanted it now.
Or they do net 180 with people?
Something like that. And then also they said they've gotten better terms from suppliers for the actual components of the vehicles. So for Model S and X, they get 45-day payments, but with Model 3, they have 60 days. And Elon called this out as a big deal, because he said that essentially what it means is that as they ramp production of Model 3, it will actually be a cash generator for Tesla instead of a cash consumer because of those payment terms, because they'll be able to actually produce the cars fast enough to get the money from the customer before they have to pay for the parts from the supplier. And so every car they make, once that timing is correct, they will be making more cash, so they won't actually need tons and tons of cash to ramp up. And so that was really new information that, and he seemed really excited about that they had figured that out. And then one of the other things he went into about how Model 3 is so different is that they'll actually also, you can't get the revenue from the customer until you get them the car. And so even if the car is produced in Fremont and they ship it, you got to get it there before that 45 or 50 days remaining comes due. That the thing that happens once you have all these cars is that they're actually going to be able to, right now they have to wait for the ships and wait for the trains because they're not big enough to buy out the entire freight train or cargo ship.
And they can't drive themselves.
But he said that now they're going to be able to book a ship whenever they want, because they're going to fill the entire ship up. And so they get better pricing on that. And they also get to control when it happens.
That's some serious ship.
That is some serious ship. So he said the net effect, instead of growth being a capital consumer, growth will be a capital producer.
Well, hope springs eternal.
Hey, but that's not crazy talk. That's pretty reasonable understanding of the cash flows for this system being different, and trying to call those out, that by getting the scale, it's not just that they are going to be making a lot more cars, but the financials of each individual car actually are materially different than for Model S and X.
True that.
Calling that out, I think, is both shows you would hope a thoughtfulness around the cash understanding of how this is all going to work, but also some of the things that they're doing differently that will actually potentially allow them to do what they're saying, and starts giving more credence to the fact that they have a plan to produce that 500,000 cars in such a short period of time, where those things weren't possible with the S and X, and also that category of car and SUV don't sell in those volumes where this category of car does.
I wonder what the difference in production cost for a Model S and a Model 3 will be. They don't seem that different.
So he said that the actual costs of the materials and the subsystems, he did call it out, are going to be about half.
Really?
From Model S and X. He said some are way more than half, and some are not as much as half. And then he also said that once you actually start doing all the development of these subsystems in-house, which they're doing to drive the cost down, they actually increase the number of suppliers quite dramatically from what they have now, because they're doing more of that vertical integration. But the value per part is obviously much lower, because the intellectual capital of building the subsystem is now going to be inside Tesla instead of paying a third party the margin.
All right. So if you had to give them a letter grade for this quarter, what would Professor Caleb rate Tesla?
I would give them an A-.
A-. Wow. That's a big... I should have probably looked up what your previous quarter was. I think it was like a B- or a C+ last time.
Yeah.
It seemed pretty hard of the bell curve last time.
Yeah. I mean, to your last question, like there was one other thing that goes into that, was saying that the Model 3 efficiency as a whole is, in their view, a quantum change in productivity. And like he said, like really, really crazy. And so that alien Dreadnought was also called out, and he thinks they're going to be at 0.5 when it launches. And he said, I think it'll take about a year, so maybe summer 2018, to actually go to Alien Dreadnought version 1. And that their goal is the limit of physics for production. So as fast as those atoms can move through the factory is what they're aiming for.
Sure, why not?
Why not? So the A- goes for this new CFO, Jason Wheeler, who's been there about a year, seems to be doing a really great job on managing their cash and improving efficiency for their spending, which has been needed. And then the production rate seems to be on track to get to their 50,000 vehicles for the end of the year. And Model 3, 3 months more data, 3 months more production work on their side. They continue to believe to be on track. And this would certainly be a time, like I said, where if you knew there were major items on that Gantt chart that were falling behind, that were unrecoverable, like those long lead time objects for the robots, if those were just not available or something was not going to happen, then now would be the time to start adjusting your plan,
or at least laying the foundation for it.
Yeah, they've communicated no change there, or even softening to say like, oh well, we're going to start production then, but it's not going to be volume. No change there. So I think that next quarter the big things are just more Model 3 work, and then Solar City, if that goes through, will certainly be a big part of the call.
Stay tuned next week for that detail.
Yeah, so I think that's it. I feel like this was definitely a pretty meaty discussion of the earnings call, and I think I think probably people can tell, but I really like these earnings calls because it's one of the best places to get information from the company on what they're doing, what their plans are, what they think is important, and you get to hear Elon Musk, JB Straubel, the CTO, and their CFO answer questions from analysts who are generally quite skeptical of them, and so they have to defend themselves, and they're not just in PR mode at their own presentations, being unchallenged. And so you really get to hear what they think and push back on people, which reveals a lot of info.
Imagine how much you'll like it if we finally get an invite to one, when we get that dial-in number.
I know. Well,
and now Caleb from the Tesla show has a question.
What to ask? They did allow press on this call. They had a few questions from like the Motley Fool and others. So they seem to be opening up a little bit. So, oh, and also it's possible in the next 3 months that we get the Model 3 reveal part 3. So it's possible that by the next quarter we'd have more information on the actual car and options and all that. But I expect that'll actually be the quarter after. So
exciting.
All right. Where can people find us if they want to comment on the BIPs and the
comment on the BIPs, or maybe if you have some sort of speculation as to what part 3 might be, you can hit us up on Twitter at The Tesla Show, on our website at theteslashow.com, or you can comment or upvote us on Reddit at r/The Tesla Show.
All right. Sounds good. Talk to you soon, Mike.
All right. Bye, Caleb.
Bye.